Hi, thanks for being here. I'm Leona Theis, and I'm happy to be part of the Library Association's initiative to create safe distance programming. I'm coming to you from Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. I am immensely grateful to live here and share in everything this land has to offer. I'm going to be reading you an entire short story from beginning to end. And then at the end of that, well, if we were all in the same room together, we would have the opportunity to do a question and answer. Since we don't have that opportunity, I propose to talk a little bit about how the book that I'll be reading from came to be, and I hope that gives you a glimpse into the writing life, or this one writer's life, and the choices that writers make as they're doing their work. Before I read, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm going to frame up the particular story or chapter in the book that I'm going to read. I am Saskatchewan born and bred, with the exception of short sabbaticals that I've lived elsewhere in Vancouver, in Australia, and France. Other than that, I have lived here all my life. Most of my work is set in this province. I write short stories, novels, creative nonfiction, and now I've written something called a novel in stories, and that's what I'll be reading from today. It's called If Sylvie Had 9 Lives. It's brand new, and I just got it in my hands about 5 hours ago, just in time to hold it up for the camera so you could see it today. In one of the glitches in the writing life, the stores have the book, but I don't have my author's copies yet, and so I borrowed one from a friend who bought it at an independent bookstore the other day. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that. In addition to being a writer, I am an editor and a mentor. I've mentored emerging writers through the Saskatchewan Writers Guild's mentorship program, and I work with graduate students at the Master of Fine Arts in Writing in Saskatoon. So to frame up the story I'm going to read today, from this, what I called a novel in stories, I'm going to tell you what I mean by a novel in stories. It means that every chapter in the book is a complete story in and of itself. It can stand alone, and some of them have been published that way. At the same time, there are themes and ideas and developments that happen over the span of the entire book. This book has a bit of an unusual structure in addition to that, in that the main character actually has 9 lives, not just the one. Early on, when I started imagining Sylvie, I knew that I didn't want to limit her to just the single life that the rest of us are all granted. I wanted her to have a broader experience of the world. And I'm going to read a paragraph from an early chapter just to tell you a bit more about what I mean, so you understand what that means a little more. In this short paragraph that I'm going to read, it's from the first story in the book, chapter 1, and we're just getting to know Sylvie and have a peek into what some of her heart's desires are. So in this scene, she is downtown dancing at a club called Yips. It's 1974 and she's 19 years old. So if some of you happen to be about my age, you might remember Yips. It was one of the only nightclubs we had in Saskatoon at that time. There was always live music. They weren't playing original music. These were cover bands, and they were playing songs that were popular at the time and that were good to dance to. There was a lot of cowbell, there were a lot of hookups, but Sylvie is here with an old friend from high school. She's not looking for a hookup, or she doesn't think that she is. And the band has just started to play Proud Mary, Creedence Clearwater Revival. It was very popular at the time. Proud Mary, a riverboat. As she danced, the image of a river came to her. A river branching into multiples of itself, no longer a single stream, but a delta. And if her life were such a delta, She might let the flow take her in a direction far from the current she was in now. If only there were more Sylvies to ride the separate streams. The further she went, the further she'd be from herself. She could end up way down the shore, so far from this Sylvie, the Jack marrying version, that all she could do would be to wave and hope to be seen. So there we have a character who dearly wants to have more than one chance at life. She's supposed to be marrying a man named Jack 2 days from now, but she wonders what it would be like if she didn't marry Jack. She wonders what it would be like if she married no one at that time. So we're just getting to know her and know those things about her. And we know she wants to have more than one life. We also have an author who dearly wants to give her more than one life. And so I did. I granted her 9 lives, which means the book has a pretty intricate structure. And the designer and I decided that it would really add to the story if we could create some maps that would help the reader know where they are as they enter each of Sylvie's separate lives in a different section. This is a map that will help orient you to the story we're about to enter when it will be 5 years later than the paragraph I just read, and it will be 1979, and Sylvie will be 5 years older. She'll be 24 years old. And these maps are supposed to be something like the maps you come across, say you're in a city that you don't know very well, or you're in a set of walking paths where you might get lost, and you come upon a big board and a red dot that says, "You are here." Well, we didn't have red dots to work with because we were working in grayscale, but we hope that it does the same job of orienting you. So I'm going to read the story now. This is called The Last Days of Disco. Sylvie is 24 in 1979. So make yourselves comfortable and I'll read you a story. Margot and Benj were necking lazily on a sand-strewn blanket. Alex and Penny lounged on web-woven lawn chairs, Penny with her eyes closed, white blonde hair twisted tight in a towel, tanning as if she was going for an A. Sylvie sat low in the canvas sling of her beach chair, the crossbar at the top pressing into the back of her skull, chair bone to head bone. And Jack? Well, Jack was pacing. In their 5 years of marriage, he might have walked all the way to Antarctica if he'd straightened out his hairpin turns and followed his toes where they led. But he wasn't one to light out for parts unknown, nor had Sylvie been when, despite her doubts, she joined him at the altar, age 19. Sunburn bloomed above his tight blue trunks. This was new for the 6 of them, to be outdoors together in daylight. They knew each other in dim bars and nighttime kitchens, in scraggly moonlit yards around smoky fires, where they threw their bottles in among the flames to watch the labels scorch. A hardcover novel she'd brought from work rested in Sylvie's lap, The Last Enchantment, thick as a brick. She ran her fingers across the impressed lettering on the cover. This was one of the things she loved best about the world. The physical feel of objects, the changes in texture under her fingers. It was what redeemed her job, mending books in an unwindowed room on the 2nd floor of the university library. No more stacking journals in the basement. Now she worked with the loose weave of binding tape, the sharp splinters of crystallized glue that hid along the edges of a separated cover waiting to nip a finger. The dependable firmness of a replacement spine. Her job was to keep a thing going beyond its time. Jack halted. It is time, people, to raise your beach bums, your sandy asses off the sand. Sylvie watched to see if his peculiar magic would work, as it so often did. She opened her book and ran her palm across a page, feeling the fine indentations of the trails of print left in the rag paper. "It is time," Jack said, "for your lesson in line dance hustle. Form yourselves into a single line, my friends, on the dock if you would." He was not as Sylvie had reminded him last night when she and he were in the screaming thick of the worst of it, a man of vision. You can see about as far as the bug screen strapped to the front of your Corolla. Sometimes, though, he did show evidence of a vision for the next 15 minutes or so. The dock where Jack wanted them to line up was a good size, a pier leading out to a square patio that stood above the water on stilts, but it wasn't nearly big enough for 5 people to dance the hustle in formation, or not for long. Sylvie dug her toes in, and the fine spill of sand across her feet was reason enough not to leave her chair. The grains against her skin, their slide, their heat. Jack stooped to tug at the corner of Benj and Margot's blanket. Repossess your tongues. Benj kicked at Jack's hand, but he got up and hoisted Margot after him, her limbs sun-honey languid. Jack grabbed Penny's chair by the legs and dumped her sideways. She gave the others a flash of breast as she slipped it out of its cup to shake away sand. Jack's reply to Sylvie's accusation last night, in the screaming thick of the worst of it, had been to say he did too have imagination. He had a semi-trailer full. People were always telling him he had a real sense of fun. Sylvie had made for the bedroom, turning her back on the living room and the insults they'd flung at each other. "Are you going to just walk away?" he'd said as she walked away. The sand so warm now, and she was so sleepy these days. She closed her eyes. Alex's sweat-wet hand landed on her knee. "Hi-oh, Silvery." She flicked the sand off her toes and followed him. Below his cutoffs, the backs of his pink legs were embossed, crisscross from the webbing of his chair. She bit back on the urge to put a finger to his skin and trace the pattern. "Your trouble," Jack had said last night. He'd whipped past to face her in the hallway. "Your trouble is nothing's ever enough. You're just plain greedy." He put one hand on his hip and leaned his opposite shoulder against the wall. "That was it when I met you, and that's it now. So arrest me." She put a hand on her hip in mockery and leaned against the wall as he did. "I wouldn't bother." "Exactly." She slapped the wall hard. "You wouldn't bother." "Exactly." He slapped the wall a bare inch from her face. She felt the wind from it like old breath. The 5 of them lined up on the dock under Jack's direction, blinking in the sun, their ripening beers abandoned, bottles aslant in the sand, bubbles expanding inside them. Benj performed a showy stretch, arms out to either side, pecs proud. "We can't dance without music." "I am your music," said Jack. "Just follow the count of 8, over and over." He clapped it out. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not exactly Soul City Symphony, but one thing you could say about Jack, he had rhythm. The rhythm method, that was another story. Still, as of last month, they were 5 years married. Anyone would say it was time. "Idiot proof," said Jack. "Now, as you Philistines may not know, Van McCoy died last week." He mimed grief with a downturned mouth and took on an MC voice. "Remember that day, July 6, 1979. This ceremonial tattoo we are about to perform on Uncle Walter's dock is the least we can do in honor of the man McCoy. Without him, we would not even have the hustle." He did the party trick where he bulged his skinny belly so it ballooned above his trunk, skin stretched taut, and used his fingers to tap out a drum roll. "Sylvie, dear Sylvie, kindly educate these novices in the steps." The conjurer's lovely assistant. "Which combination," she said. "Master," she added, in the manner of I Dream of Jeannie, the clear-eyed woman in harem pants on the small screen, who would swing her blonde ponytail and pretend she wasn't the one making the decisions. As a kid, Sylvie used to feel as if she was in a conspiracy with Jeannie against all the boys in the world. "The one with the heel slap, dear silly." It was the most teachable of the combinations the two of them had learned in ballroom dancing classes at the gym in the school down the block from their apartment. A short pattern, repeated, and 4 reps would make a square. Except the rolling grapevine sequence tended to loosen when you stepped it out, but tighten when you reeled it in, which meant the square would shift along the dance floor by a foot or so each time through. Then you turned 90 degrees and the pattern wanted 4 steps back. In the school gym one evening, Sylvie had danced backward into the grid of a metal light cage mounted on the wall, head bone to light bone. This afternoon she would play Jack's game, sure, show off her own sense of fun. Earlier in the day, as Sylvie floundered in water up to her armpits, Margot had said, "You're not exactly fluent as a swimmer, are you?" It was a fair comment, but she could keep her head up. Jack couldn't swim to save his life. You could bet that once the dance was done, he'd be standing dry and alone on the dock. 1, 2, 3, 4. A dazzling disco sun above, Jack clapping the beat, Sylvie leading the other 4 in the simple sequence, forward 2, back 2, kick, turn, and on. They caught the pattern with hardly a misstep. 1 pair of cutoffs and 1 pair of bulging Speedos, 3 pairs of breasts slung into bikini bras, Penny's with the most generous swing on the turns, the most emphatic bounce when it was time to rise on tiptoe and slap her heels together. Sylvie had less bounce, less swing, but a pretty sweet bikini, and her breasts would swell by a cup size at least, she expected, over the coming months. Sweat trickled down her back, wicking to either side where it met her bikini bottoms. She'd been sick to her stomach at 5 a.m., then brushed her teeth clean of evidence and stolen back into bed beside a sleeping Jack. She'd woken again at 7, her insides settled for the day if the pattern of the past couple of weeks was anything to go by. The beat of the dance. Kick, turn. "Disco here," she said to make Alex laugh beside her as she stomped a foot. "And disco there." Alex did laugh, and Jack said, "Hey, it's my show." She glanced along the weathered boards, still a few feet of dock between dancers and water. Last night, raw from shouting and sex, she'd said, "You know your biggest problem? You never think what if about anything. Not your job, not your tooth decay, not your brand of beer. It's like you can't imagine how any of that could change." For a year and a half, roughly the gestation period of an elephant, she'd been preparing to say that or something like it, then letting her lips go dry with her own silence. "Don't you think that by 24 you should be deciding what you want to be when you grow up?" "I did that," he said, "long ago. Don't you think that if you didn't, you're kind of late?" 5 years ago, as she'd stood holding her friend Eric's hand while Jack, passed out and moaning, rolled from his back onto his side on the braided scatter rug in the basement suite, she'd said, "Jack makes me laugh." "Ha," said Eric, "so do I." She let go of Eric's hand. "All I want," she said, "is an ordinary life, nothing fancy. An ordinary job, a little house, kids one day. Save up for the big holiday in Hawaii 5 years from now." "I don't believe you." On the dock, Jack clapped a final 5, 6, 7, 8 and handed off the beat to the slap of 10 bare soles on wood. Sylvie tapped forward twice, back twice, swung her leg through and looked over her shoulder to see Alex's back foot lose its toehold on the boards. He fell butt first into the water with a great, flailing splash. He started to swear, but his head went under and the word got dunked. The others laughed, but didn't break their rhythm. On the next sequence, Penny made a show of balancing on the edge and then let herself fall. They'd seen this from the start, of course they had, and still they were game. Back then, Eric had used a gentle palm to turn Sylvie's gaze away from Jack and toward himself. We're 19 years old, Syl. Why do you want to know your whole future? Doesn't everyone? How else would that woman on 20th with the big glass ball and the little stars from the teacher's store sprinkled in her hair, how else would she make a living? How do you know she's got stars in her hair? Have you been to see her? She has a window right on the street. Anyone can see her sitting there. What did she tell you? You're infuriating. Benj, dancing behind her now that the line had turned, said, don't you have the most lickable little dimples just above splash? And Sylvie was next in, laughing, pinching her nose. She panicked almost, then collected herself. Treading water should be just another dance step. Benj swam up as if to rescue her and nuzzled her neck. Jack on the dock flipped the finger at Benj and all three of them laughed. Benj's breath hot on her skin. Cross-couple flirting was one of her favorite things about the six of them, harmless and open, always in plain sight. She managed with her faltering tread to keep her head above water. Margot finally danced herself in, surfaced and swam 2 strokes back to the dock, where she rested her manicured fingertips and looked up at Jack. Last man standing, he mimed Travolta, bouncing in his snug blue trunks. Sylvie felt Benj's hand touch her knee under the water, felt it slide up her thigh. On the dock, Jack was more energy than style, ending with a 180 spin, an arm raised, pointing toward the disco ball of a sun. He held the pose, puffing. Margot was still looking up at him. You gotta dance yourself in. No way, I'm the music. In bed last night, when neither the fighting nor the sex had ended in a release that satisfied either of them, Jack had said, does this mean you're not coming to the lake tomorrow? Oh, I'll come. They're expecting us. Fun in the sun. And such. Christ, Sylvie. Christ. Now she stayed close to Benj, feeling the absence where his hand had left her leg. Jack said, the sunshine band. Sylvie reached an underwater hand toward Benj. Closer. Closer. He stared deliberately ahead, and she saw how he was waiting, expectant. She stopped short of touching, maneuvered herself away from him, felt a pleasant lurch inside. Alex swam past, hiked himself onto the dock, took a run at Jack, and shouted, "Boo-yah!" And they were in. Jesus, Sylvie shouted, he can't swim. Alex surfaced, showering her with a flip of his wet hair. No Jack. The others were oblivious, at play. Benj ran a fast hand over the water, driving a jeweled arc toward Penny. You guys, Sylvie said, but then hesitated while it flashed that Jack could be gone, so simply. Benj, behind her now, gave her butt a hard, angry pinch. The jolt brought her back to herself. He can't swim. She put her legs and arms into clumsy motion, trying to propel herself toward the place where he'd gone under. Jack flailed his way to the surface and gasped for air. Alex said, "What do you mean, can't swim?" And he laughed and put a hand to the top of Jack's head and pushed. How's that saying go? Drowning, not waving? Jesus, Sylvie did a frantic, ineffectual dog pedal. Jack came up again, still out of her reach, slipped under. You guys! Holy, you're serious! Alex dove, his feet strewing water gems. As the ripple from his dive spread, Jack burst the surface, sputtering. He coughed and took in a rough breath, went down again. Sylvie got hold of his arm. He flailed in a fury. Alex broke the surface. Stop with the windmill, man. I'll get you to the dock. But Sylvie had to be the one to get him there. Alex was laughing, and nothing was funny. Bugger off, she yelled. Legs churning, she tried to get an arm around Jack's chest from behind as he went down again. Sylvie, geez, said Alex, reaching. Jack pulled her under, and she lost him.
came up coughing, her throat burning. Alex had him now, an arm circling his chest, so close to the dog, just a few more feet. Jack was flailing less now, sputtering more. Sylvie's butt was a weight, her legs were weights. She gulped in air just before slipping under again, the burn deep in her nostrils. Tell me, water. Tell me what happens next for me and this child. If she were to open her mouth and let the lake fill it, and fill her throat and her lungs, her head too, then the water would tell her. She closed her eyes. She readied herself. She opened her mouth. A violent spasm seized her throat and she thrashed. She felt arms lift her and she stiffened and then surrendered. When she broke the surface, she thought she would cough her whole insides out. Penny said, okay, let's get you out, Syl. She was aware of the others, the commotion as Alex and Margot and Benj hefted Jack to safety. Penny's arm pressed up underneath her tender breasts. I'm okay? She slipped free of Penny's hold. On her back in the water now, she gathered herself and pushed out a single sudden frog kick to propel herself back to the dock. But she misjudged her own power and bumped her head on a post. Ouch, Sylvie, let me help you up. I'm fine. She wanted to say, leave me the hell alone. But thank you. She hoisted herself onto the boards, clumsy with the effort, suffering the scrape of the wood against her bare midriff. She made her way on hands and knees to where Jack lay shuddering on his stomach, spitting onto the silvered timbers. Alex stood and used the side of his hand to squeegee water from his belly and his legs. Are you going to live, Callahan? He shook his head to scatter drops across Jack's back, where they caught the light like a party going on. Sylvie felt a clench in her gut, a swelling in her eyes. I gotta go take a crap, Alex said. As he made to leave, Jack grabbed at his ankle with little ambition and missed. Weak and hollowed out, Sylvie lay down on the warm dock and curled an arm and a leg around Jack. Stupid trick for a guy who can't swim. Yeah, he said. People who can't swim shouldn't throw glass at houses. She put her lips to his spine and kissed a bump of bone. Her main trouble wasn't that she'd seen for an instant a clear space. Her main trouble was how familiar that moment was, the wanting. Afternoons when he was hours late getting home from work and she waited at the kitchen table for the knock. Nights he crashed on a buddy's sofa without calling. Hunting season. She pressed her mouth harder against his spine. Behind her, Benj laughed. Get a room. Sylvie felt the shake through her hip and her shoulder and her quivering thighs as he stomped past on the dock, and she felt it diminish as he walked away. In a parking spot Sylvie paid nominal rent on, in back of a bungalow near their apartment building, sat the rumbly meteor Eric had sold her years ago for $1 after watching her struggle with the manual transmission on Jack's Corolla. Maybe he'd expected, even as he tossed her the keys, that she'd one day use it as a getaway car. Last week, she'd purged her closets and heaved into the back seat a giant garbage bag bound for the thrift store at the YW. Flared jeans and wraparound skirts, blouses with Peter Pan collars, a pair of pink panties with red lettering that said, Enter to Win, that she'd stuffed in the pocket of her coat on an amble through the Army and Navy store. That bag was still in the car. She could be gone tonight. Wouldn't even have to enter the apartment. Last Sunday, when Jack went out the door on the way to Uncle Walter's acreage to cut grass, she'd locked the deadbolt behind him and even slid the chain into its slot. He might be gone 3 hours. She'd felt a letting go in the muscles of her upper back. She was on her way to the bedroom to get back into her PJs and slump into bed to experience the spread of the entire mattress to herself and the expanse of air above, where her breath and thoughts could rise and meander without hindrance, when she heard him in the hallway again. He tried the door, resorted to his key, and was stopped by the jerk of the chain. The hell? She opened for him. He'd brought his mug in from the truck, and he filled it with coffee for the road and poured in a drizzle of rye. One corner of his mustache stuck into his mouth in a way that made her want to reach and pull it out for God's sake. He was teasing when he said, "You locking me out, Syl?" No. Trying to lock possibility in. She took the bottle from his hand and splashed rye and then coffee into her own mug and thought, well, there's something we have in common, whiskey. Leaving could take years. It already had. On the dock, she tucked Jack's wet hair back around his misshapen earlobe and whispered, for her own sake, "I saved your life." She felt the hot spot of soreness where Benja's angry pinch had twisted her flesh. If he hadn't startled her just then, would she have woken to the moment? She tried going back for a second to check how that moment had felt, but the door was closed. She couldn't imagine being a person who would let another person drown. Some things you just had to act on, saving a life, leaving a life. There were other things that would happen if you did nothing. All it would take was for Sylvie to do nothing, and this cell division, this multiplication going on in her womb, would change itself from accident into person. Let life happen. The money they'd saved for Hawaii would have a new use. She moved her hand along Jack's arm, her palm fitting itself to the small bulge of his bicep. This is my husband. These are the people who know me, or think they do. Jack had his job at the bus yards. He had his personal cause in helping out old Walter, which seemed to come naturally. Uncle Walter, who'd handed over the keys for this Sunday afternoon to the cabin Jack hoped to one day own, along with 60 feet of shoreline and the mossy, rotting roof and the septic tank that was probably cracked. Being written into Walter's will was more in the nature of bonus than calculation. But he did have his plan, Jack. Spooned together, they fell asleep on the unforgiving boards and woke to the sound of jangling keys and Alex's cool shadow falling over them. "I do believe," he said, "I've stumbled upon the keys to Walter's formidable 90-horse cruiser. Just hanging inside the shed they were, as if on offer." Jack raised himself on one elbow, leaned over the edge of the dock, hawked and spit. "Get me something to drink." Alex offered the beer he was holding, a third full. "Water was what I had in mind." Jack reached for it, chugged what was left, and let the bottle roll. "Put the keys away, you're in no shape." He lay back down, and Sylvie circled her arm around him, her fingers memorizing the feel of him for the times she would need it. From over on the sand, she heard the indistinct voices of the others trailing through the threadbare afternoon. None of this would go into the meteor. Not Alex and his loud boo-yahs, nor Benja's breath on her neck, nor Margot's hot and cold friendship, nor the smell of the lake, nor the rise and fall of Jack's belly against her palm. She would have to replace these with other things. Her hip relaxed against the dock as she allowed her weight to shift and settle. She was almost asleep again when she heard the motor rumble. Jack jolted upright and shouted over the noise, "Did Alex know the definition of grade A jerk?" Penny was on the run from the beach. She vaulted into the boat before it veered away. "I got him," she said, fighting for balance, breasts swinging. Jack held his hands to his temples. Christ. Alex ceded the wheel to Penny, who steered the boat back around in a wide arc. "Everything's all right," Sylvie said to Jack, and she was struck by the familiar shape of the lie. Everything's okay. She felt the hard slap of water against the dock from the turn of the boat. She ran her hand along the weathered planks, rough under her palm. She was hoping for a fat splinter, the kind that's easy to pull out once it's quickened your blood. So there we have a look at Sylvie, 24 years old in 1979, and we see that she did marry Jack, or at least in this life, in this story, she married Jack. In other lives, she didn't. Her dilemmas at the end of this story are whether to stay in that marriage or how to leave that marriage and what to do about the pregnancy. It's no coincidence that in 1979, when Sylvie was 24 years old, I also was 24 years old. It's also no coincidence that in 2014, when the book closes and Sylvie was 59, I was also 59. That does not for 1 minute mean that Sylvie is me or I am her, nor does it mean that the various characters who populate Sylvie's 9 lives have anything to do with the people who populated my life. They're all made up, as is Sylvie. What it does mean is that I can be authentic about some of the sensibilities for the places and times Sylvie lived. It also means that I'm familiar with some of the news stories of the day that play a role, especially thematically, in different parts of the story. So the days of the last days of disco and the end of the hustle. Also the O.J. Simpson chase, which comes into play about halfway through the novel at a time when Sylvie's in a life that doesn't turn out very well for her. That coincidence also means that in the early 1970s, I did take ballroom dancing classes, and I did learn at least one version of the New York hustle, much of which I remember. And if needed, if you asked me to, I could step it out right here and now, but I will spare you that. I said that this is a novel in stories, and I'll just return to that because I can name some other novels in stories that I can recommend that I've really enjoyed myself. So by novel and stories, again, we mean that every chapter is a story that can stand alone on its own. But also over the course of the book, there are some themes and developments that span the entire book. And some things that happen to the peripheral characters that develop over the course of the book. And also it's my hope that over the 40 years from the time Sylvie is 19 to 59, even though we join her in a different life each time, it's my hope that that core Sylvie has grown up a little bit by the time she's almost 60 years old, that she's matured a little bit and is maybe easier to be around, which is not to say that she succeeds in overcoming all her flaws. She's definitely a flawed character, and aren't we all? There are 3 other novels and stories that I want to tell you about and I can recommend. The first is Olive Kitteridge. It's just written by an American author, Elizabeth Strout. It's about 10 or 15 years old by now, and it won the Pulitzer Prize the year it came out. It's also a miniseries, I think, on Netflix with Frances McDormand. And the miniseries is a little bit different from the book, but Olive remains the same. And she's also a very flawed character. You wouldn't necessarily want to hang out with her a lot, but she sure is interesting to get to know. So that's one, Olive Kitteridge. There's another one by Jennifer Egan. It's called A Visit from the Goon Squad. And it's a really unusual novel in stories, and some of the later chapters project into the future in really prescient ways, things that are almost already coming true as we speak. And then for a Canadian example, I don't have a copy to show you, but Carrie Ann Lung has written a set of what she calls linked stories. Sometimes the line between a set of linked stories and a novel in stories is kind of hazy and it's debatable. But Carrie Ann Lung's book is called That Time I Loved You, and I think it also is being made into a miniseries for TV. So those are 3 that I can recommend. There are lots more out there, and it's a form that I particularly enjoy. I want to talk a little bit about writer's choices and give you that glimpse into the writing life, I hope, and how I came to write this book with its unusual format. So choices are a fact of life. Every time we make a choice, we close off a host of other possibilities. It's a fact of life, and it's a fact of fiction writing too. So the myriad choices that I make on behalf of my characters, often without even realizing that I'm doing it, define their lives and their loves, their potential and their lost potential too. I don't know if you think this way, but I can think of a number of other possible selves that I might have turned out to be. For instance, there is somewhere in my imagination anyway, there is a version of me who's still working in the garment factory that I quit at 19. And like me, when she was 19, she almost sewed her finger into a pair of blue jeans that she was working on. Unlike me, this alternate version of me had had an excellent night's sleep the night before, and she was ready to take on anything. And that sewing mishap, which could be read as a sign, and that sign could be either move on or move on up. This imaginary version of me took that sign to be move on up. And so today, she's a factory supervisor in the same factory. And she's not rich, but she does all right. She has a good life. She probably has a grown son or daughter. She maybe was divorced 10 years ago and she's fine with that. She's doing all right. I can imagine being her, but I don't want to be her. And nor do I imagine she hankers to be me, because after all, the people she loves are over there in the life she's living. So that's one example. I can think of half a dozen other possible me's. But why do I bring her into this discussion? Well, just as one example of how something as momentary and trivial seeming as a sewing mishap and a good night's sleep can send your life this way or that way. So the actual me took that sewn together finger as a sign to move on, and I left that factory the next day. So it's about choices, and the choices writers have to make, and the way they close off possibilities, just the way the choices in your life close off possibilities. There's an American writer named Gail Bowen, and I just want to read you a quotation from her. She said, "One option must die so that another may live. I do little murders in my workroom every day," end quote. She does little murders in her workroom every day. Well, so do I. So every time I make a choice on behalf of my characters, a whole lot of plot lines vanish. And I kind of miss them. So I'll tell you a story about how this book came to be. It was at least 10 years ago. I was in the midst of working on an entirely different novel, which still isn't finished because I got sidetracked by this one. I was on my way from Saskatoon to Toronto, and I had a layover in Winnipeg Airport. And I know that most travelers don't like stopovers, but I kind of welcome them, because to me, it's this anonymous airport concourse full of strangers that I don't know is a place that's between worlds and out of time, and my brain can relax, and I go into that kind of thoughtless thought that is a very important part of my creative process as a writer. That I've heard that state called alpha wave activity, and it's as if all the windows in your brain open up, and so anything from left field can float in through one of those windows and land. And that day when I was sitting in Winnipeg Airport with a cup of coffee at a bistro table and I was hearing the hubbub of strangers and luggage wheels, what flew into one of those windows in my mind was this thought. I thought, just once I'm going to write a book where I don't close off all those other avenues. I'm going to leave at least some of those possibilities open. Just once I'm going to let my character eat her cake and have it too. And so that's how I came to dream up 9 different lives for Sylvie and 9 different turning points. And the turning points can be as trivial as getting distracted by a sneeze, which is something that happens to Sylvie in chapter 1 of the book. Or something as trivial as somebody not knowing what they're doing but pinching your butt for a different reason, which is what we saw in the story I just read. And what would have happened if he hadn't pinched her at that moment and she hadn't had the presence of mind, she hadn't come back into the situation and been present enough to say, he can't swim. So it could be that in one of her other lives, that all happened differently. We'll see. I think it's almost time to wrap up. If you want to hear more of my work or see more of my work, check your library. Also, I have a webpage where you can read some essays, creative nonfiction, and some parts of other novels and stories that I've written. Before I go, I want to be sure to thank the Library Association again and our videographer here. Also, I need to thank the Saskatchewan Arts Board and the Canada Council for supporting my work and also for supporting the arts in general, especially during these times when, like everyone else, the arts are having a hard time. So, thanks are in order. And I want to thank you for spending time. Bye-bye.